Before I get started, I just want to give a little disclaimer that there's no rhyme or reason to what I'm going to put on this feed. Things that I think that I can record well, I'm going to put on the feed, and things that I can't, I won't. And that's the new rules until I change them again. But this is a fun little essay that I wrote. You can find the text of it at bytonyrusso.com. As always, thank you so very much for listening. And if you get a kick out of it, tell anyone you know. All right, let's get into it. The Delmar Youth Center, or What God Wants, God Gets. God Help Us All, by Tony Russo. A recent Sunday night brought a spiteful spring wind, which arrived like a passive-aggressive coworker slamming around, waiting to be asked what's wrong before replying, "Nothing. I'm the wind. I blow. What's your problem?" It rattled the thick poly sheeting over the pair of western-facing side screens. Decades ago, I'd been grateful to get a set of 7 massive double-paned windows for free without considering that they were literally an irreplaceable gift. Still, over the last few years since I've lost the 2 western-facing panes, the thrum-thrum of the plastic windows has always sounded weather-appropriate, breathing like a massive kite. Just like the train at the end of my street, it's part of how my life sounds. I've cut way back on drinking, treating myself to 1 glass of whiskey for each weekend day. On this March Sunday, I'd treated myself to a cigar and a second tumbler of Akatoshin while I tinkered with stories and watched the wind blow the dusk away for the night. Someone was hitching up the far side of the street, bound for the house across from mine. Their bearing suggested salesperson. The time and day suggested they were probably selling Jesus. The figure jounced up the steps, harmless, a guy with a question who just needs but a second of your time. My neighbor opened the door, and I saw the solicitor in relief, waving a folded document like he was hailing a cab. He was granted access, and the porch went dark. It's funny how we judge our neighbors without knowing it. The guy across the street didn't seem the type who'd be open to religious conversion at 6 p.m. on a Sunday. In fact, the missionary was there long enough that I figured they had an appointment and turned back to my work, tinkering again between puffs of my cigar until the movement drew my eye as the figure left the house and made his way down the stairs toward the street. I was warm from whiskey and relished the confrontation. If you knock on my door after 6 p.m. on a Sunday to sell me something, you've relinquished your personhood. Whatever I say to you, you deserve. Then I remembered how I looked. I have cigar clothes, an old sweater that I wear over a defunct gray felt robe with 1/3 of the left pocket hanging free. The loops are gone, which is just as well because there's no belt to thread through them. Throw in a pair of sweatpants and a bleach-ruined baggy sweater, and it's the height of post-apocalyptic leisure wear. In my defense, they're for wearing when I'm smoking a cigar on the porch, not meeting the Queen. Still, I knew anyone desperate enough to be selling door-to-door on a Sunday night would do their best to overlook my appearance. Hell, if he was hawking Jesus, I'd be his target demographic, someone who'd surrendered to vice and sloth. While the notion gave me a chuckle, I also remembered my dress limited my options. When you're dressed like a mental patient and have booze on your breath, it's best not to make sudden moves or vague threats. When I'm dressed like a grown person, I can say pretty much what I please. I might come off as a jerk, but not as a danger to myself and others. The clothes make the man, after all. I looked at my cigar and contemplated abandoning it and hiding like some Halloween grouch until he'd gone away, but demurred. It was little more than a stub, but that, along with the final 2 ounces of scotch, represented the last of my weekly ration. Instead, I'd be curt, with a side of slightly drunk, talking without taking the cigar from my mouth, and sending him away, maybe threaten to set the dog on him. The plan hadn't solidified in my head when I saw him making his way across the street. "No sudden moves, they hate that," sprang to my head, and I giggled to myself. Then he was at the screen door, all jocularity and want. The window plastic thrummed harder, so he was fairly shouting against the rising gale to be let in. I pressed my hands to my knees, cigar poking between the fingers in my right hand, and hefted myself up, put on my old man gait, and shuffled mutteringly toward the door. "What do you want?" I hadn't heard him clearly, but before he could speak, I saw the whole picture. It was one of the town councilmen. He was here to pitch his rape factory. Part 2. A Town Lost. The reason I started trying to write my Bagel Manifesto was that I wanted to try to come to terms with losing the culture war. So many people have their bagels toasted here that, back when I used to buy bagels on Delmarva, I had to watch its preparation so I could stop them when they inevitably tried to toast mine. No amount of emphatic ordering helped. If you sell bagels here, you're in auto toast mode, a nightmare from which you cannot wake. This applies across culture. It's why we get superhero movies and sequels and why religious mania runs amok. It's too exhausting and inconvenient to object in a world where everyone seems fine with institutional mediocrity. It's one reason I stopped writing about Delmar. After the constant ranting, the research, the time and effort invested, I finally realized that while I was screaming, "We're handing our town over to religious maniacs and thieves," my neighbors were saying, "Yes, we know, and we're cool with it as long as the garbage gets picked up." Although I wear it well, I never wanted to be a crank. The people who show up at town council meetings as if the fix weren't already in to make their Mr. Smith Goes to Washington speeches are somehow pitiable to me. I left off covering or thinking about Delmar because I had other things to write that I hoped might be meaningful. Also, I'm an American and there's no money in it. You're welcome to go back through all the stories, link in the show notes, but for context, a group of anonymous, cowardly, local business persons bought the town council for a trio of, let's say, incurious men. We openly prize faith over book learning on Delmarva, no matter how many statutory rapes we have to overlook. Don't get me started on the religious sadism camp and thrift store in nearby Seaford, Delaware. One of the then-candidate Slate's big ideas was to use state matching funds to turn the former police station into a youth center. The councilpersons, some of whom were builders, recognized the need to spend money on real work. But childcare isn't real work because you can do it in your spare time. It's the Christian thing to do. And after all, it's women's work. There is a necessary gullibility tied to religious faith, which isn't to say that all the faithful are gullible. Instead, faith gives more weight to the absurd or improbable and demands more of human consistency than is reasonable. Faith in a higher power, despite the world's horrors, takes forbearance. Separating what you want from what God wants takes fortitude. For some people, it's just easier to let your credulity muscles atrophy. Humanitarian horrors are either the devil's work or a long overdue smiting. If you're truly one with God, then his wants and your wants are the same. It's a worldview that's a lot less taxing. Cynical as I am, I don't believe anyone running the show in Delmar wants to endanger children. What's concerning is the 91% of child abuse perpetrators the CDC attributes to family members and trusted adults, like pastors, for example. There is one local street preacher who has come to symbolize Delmarva for me. He's a reformed heroin addict who, after getting clean thanks to Jesus, is desperate for others to ask Jesus to relieve them of personal responsibility and to cure their addiction to reality. He came to my attention when he solicited an amen from the assembled at a town meeting. He didn't live in Delmar, Maryland at the time, but as any religious nutball will tell you, God's truth makes human laws meaningless. Whether it's shooting physicians, beating homosexuals, or taking over a town meeting, it's all the same. God's will is not about reason. It's beyond it. That, as they will tell you, is the very point of faith. Anyway, it wasn't long after God told this man to proclaim the need for a shepherd in Delmar that the then-candidate Slate began beating the youth center drum. Correlation is not causation, but sometimes it's just too much fun to ignore. I decided then and there that the new kings of Delmar would put this low-rent John the Baptist in charge of the youth center. I have no reason to believe this, but reason and belief apparently have nothing to do with one another. Were I a parent of young Delmartians, it would bother me how comfortable these guys are with putting felons in positions of power. Part 3. Sticky Fingers. Before the last election, as if not having a volunteer-run youth center wasn't bad enough, Delmar was paying a black woman $95,000 a year to be town manager. I don't have access to the kind of hyperbole needed to relate the level of vitriol this number caused. The upshot of the election was that the new council would fix both of these abominations, and 126 of the 200 or so residents that voted agreed. The other 4,800 townspeople didn't care one way or the other. The town manager didn't last a year and was replaced by Jeff Fleetwood, who looks like a town manager is supposed to look, tall and formerly fit, with salt and pepper hair and an appropriate patrician complexion. Also, he was being investigated for felony embezzlement after bilking the town of Berlin out of nearly $20,000 as a secret parting gift to himself. Fortunately, Delmar has a liberal work-from-home policy, and the judge sentenced him to house arrest. Now that he's free, the town fathers want to put him in charge of something approaching $2 million to pay builders and engineers for their youth center. After all, Jesus said if a man steals from your neighbor, put him in a position to steal from you too. Plus, as we all know, white-collar felons don't pose the same danger to society as, say, some junkie who hasn't found Jesus yet. Now that the council has hired a reformed embezzler to run its finances, how can they object to putting a reformed sex offender in charge of their youth program? Especially if it's someone reformed by faith. As it stands, Fleetwood's not in a position to raise objections about malfeasance. After all, let ye among you without sin cast the first stone. White, corrupt, and desperate to stay employed is how we like our town managers. As a matter of fact, I'll bet he didn't even balk at the cost of the Letterman's jackets. Part 4. Back at the door. Corey Schaefer looked adorable in his Delmar councilman leather jacket, and I honestly could see the appeal. He went from a workaday schmo to co-captain of Team Delmar with his best buddies, probably just as he had dreamed back in history class. I'm grateful he was wearing the jacket because I wouldn't have recognized him otherwise. When covering the council, I listened remotely. I couldn't pick any of them out of a police lineup. As I touched the door handle to let him in, Corey said a word that wasn't youth center, but something more funding-friendly. Enrichment? Education? I have to be honest, I was so joyfully baffled by the visit that I had a hard time focusing. The entire story you're listening to now appeared in my head all at once. It didn't help that I wasn't dressed for discussion. I was dressed for forced medication. No, I said, as he asked to come in and tell me about the Enrichment Education Center. I know all about it. You're going to put that heroin guy in charge. I wish I could do the timbre of his response justice, but I'm not skilled enough. Did you ever mean to talk to yourself but spoke out loud instead? It's still only you in the room, but the fact that you spoke would have given anyone who heard you the impression you were addressing them. It was kind of like that. His voice didn't crack, but the tone was so utterly perplexed that it might have. Heroin guy? He asked as I turned and shuffled back to my chair. Unfazed on his errand to spread the good news, he made his way back to the sidewalk and slantwise across the street to the next house, where he gained entry and resumed evangelizing. Still, eventually there will be a ribbon cutting, followed by the logistical and financial realities concomitant with running a youth facility. Those weren't on the builder's plans Corey was hawking because they take more effort than drawing some boxes on some architectural paper. You get the government you deserve. I'm just here for my grandkids and whatever cancer I get from our failing water plant. I'll send out an update after the first volunteer is arrested. Keep the faith. Postscript. I got a note from the town today. They're asking people to self-report whether they have lead pipes. That's a weird way to find out you might have lead pipes. I've never been so happy to have had a recent plumbing crisis in my life. Postscript. A small disclaimer. Here's the thing. There is no mention of a proposed youth center anywhere on the town website. It is not listed for discussion and hasn't been on recent agendas. And although the incurious slate ran on full transparency, there are no meeting minutes available, so there's no way to know whether they were talking about it. I found this out when I was looking for a link. I hope it's their incompetence and not my deafness, but it's something that I should consider. Maybe I'm way off here. I may have reread this story too many times, and I have to admit it's possible that I didn't hear right. He could have been hawking Jesus, such is my level of mistrust. In fact, it's only now, as this story enters its final edit, that it even occurred to me I could have been wrong and it could have been anything other than the promised youth center. Hell, I've told this story 10 times. The wind, the enthusiasm, the jacket, the folded paper, the hearing something that wasn't youth. The feeling of certainty hasn't left my breast, but the fear of being wrong has also wrangled a little bit of headspace. I think it's because I have a stake in being wrong. As a matter of fact, it's the best case scenario. If I misheard him and they're wasting a ton of money on something that's not likely to endanger kids or to unduly burden the tax base of the future, I would be thrilled. I rarely want this desperately to be mistaken. If I am, I'll let you know. So, what do you think? I know I'm the one who's been doing all the talking, but I would love to hear your take on it. You can reach me via email at bytonyrusso@gmail.com, or you can just go to the website, go to bytonyrusso.com. You can click on Delmar Uncensored, which is what I'm calling this series on Delmar, and find this post and send your feedback along there. I've got a ton of other things cooking. I am going to do another podcast project that won't be on this feed. So if you're not subscribed to the By Tony Russo newsletter, that would be cool if you did. That way you would know, but I will tell you in this feed if you prefer to keep it just on your podcatcher. This was written and produced by me, Tony Russo. Also, if you don't follow the blog, you may want to check out my Instagram feed, which is at By Tony Russo. I've been doing another piece of silliness where every day I record the best sentence I've written so far that day at random times. And it's goofy, but it's fun. And if you are a regular reader, you will pick up some of the sentences that eventually make it into any of my work, from the work I do for writing for a funeral service to my kooky blogs. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you next time.